to the future. Could it actually happen with a real time machine? That's tonight's IDEA, our series.
In 2022, a man who had been missing for 29 years knocked on a stranger's door in rural Ohio, carrying journals, mysterious diagrams, and evidence that didn't make sense. His name was Mike Markham. The last time anyone saw him was 1997, the night he stepped into a machine he built inside his own garage and vanished without a trace. When investigators arrived, they found melted copper, destroyed transformers, and a perfect 6-foot circular burn pattern scorched into the concrete. There was no body, no remains, just a note. It's not about time, it's about how you see things. For decades, people assumed Mike was dead until he came back. And what he brought with him was far worse than anyone expected. Let's dive in. The genius outsider. Before the time machine, before everything went wrong, the real question is, was he even capable of building something like this in the first place? The answer doesn't start in 1997. It starts much earlier in the kind of life Mike Markham lived and the strange direction his mind kept going in from the beginning. Mike grew up in rural Missouri during the 70s and 80s. No formal training, no university education, no scientific background that anyone could point to. He was just someone who never stopped looking at machines differently than everyone else. He had a strong fascination with figures like Nikola Tesla. He would spend hours reading about Tesla coils, high-voltage experiments, and early electrical theories that felt almost unreal at the time. That curiosity slowly turned into hands-on work. In a small garage behind a rented farmhouse, Mike started building his own systems, not polished or professional, but raw, improvised setups made from junkyard transformers, wires, coils, and anything he could modify. He built Tesla coils that threw long electrical arcs into the air. He built Jacob's ladder systems, where electricity climbed upward between two metal rods, stretching and moving in unstable patterns. He tested high-voltage configurations that most people would never attempt outside of controlled labs. But what made Mike different wasn't just what he built, it was what he noticed. During one of his Jacob's ladder experiments, he introduced something simple into the setup, a low-cost laser pointer aimed directly through the electrical arc. But then he saw a change. The arc didn't behave the same way anymore. It looked more focused, more stable, almost like it was responding to the light itself. That was the first moment he paused, and after that, he started testing more carefully. He placed small objects between the rods, screws, coins, washers, random metal pieces. Most of the time, nothing unusual happened, but sometimes, for just a fraction of a second, those objects were no longer visible, and then back again, in the exact same place. At first, he tried to explain it away as an error, lighting, or a distraction from the brightness of the arc, but the pattern didn't stop. And slowly, Mike stopped treating it like a mistake. Mike had created something that could bend the boundary between what is seen to turn this strange effect into something real, something controllable. He needed more than just curiosity and scrap metal. He needed power. He needed resources. He needed financial support. And to get that, he reached out to a man who had heard claims like this before on a late-night radio show. The Art Bell Call. In January 1995, Mike called a late-night radio show called Coast to Coast AM, hosted by Art Bell. It wasn't a scientific platform, not a university panel, not a research institute. It was a late-night space where strange claims, unexplained stories, Mike got through, and when he started speaking, he didn't sound like someone trying to entertain the idea. He sounded careful, almost nervous, like he knew how it would sound to an outside listener. He told Art Bell that he had built a machine in his garage that could make objects disappear for fractions of a second, and then bring them back, unchanged. Art Bell didn't dismiss him immediately. That was important. He asked simple questions, trying to understand the setup. Could it be an illusion? Could it be something with light, reflection, or timing? But Mike kept insisting it wasn't that simple. He described how objects didn't just flicker in his view, they were gone and then returned exactly where they were. The space around the machine felt different when it happened, like the air itself changed, and then came something more unsettling. Mike mentioned that animals reacted to it. His dog wouldn't go near the garage anymore. Birds stopped landing near the roof. He believed living things could sense something wrong in the field. That part made the call go quiet again. Art Bell didn't laugh it off, but he also didn't confirm it. He stayed cautious, asking him to document everything, to record it, to bring proof. It was the closest thing Mike had gotten to being taken seriously. But it wasn't what he needed. Belief in a radio call didn't build anything. It didn't give him power, equipment, or funding. When the call ended, Mike was exactly where he started, standing next to something he believed was real, but completely alone with it. Because if no one would help him, then waiting was no longer an option. And that's when his thinking crossed a line into something far more extreme, something no one could control anymore. The illegal obsession. What Mike had seen in that garage needed far more power than he could safely generate on his own. And instead of stopping to think about the risks, instead of waiting for support, he crossed a line most people wouldn't even come close to. In the summer of 1995, Mike did something reckless and illegal. He broke into a rural electrical substation and stole industrial transformers, heavy equipment, the kind designed to handle massive power loads across entire regions. He didn't take one or two, he took several, and then he brought them back to his garage. There, he wired them together into a system that could pull extreme amounts of electricity directly from the grid. And when he activated it, the results were immediate and violent. The power draw was so large that it caused a brownout across nearby properties. Lights dimmed in houses miles away. Equipment failed. People had no idea what was happening, only that something was wrong with the electrical supply. Utility investigators traced the disturbance back to one place, Mike Markham's garage. He was arrested shortly after, charged with theft and reckless endangerment, and sentenced to 60 days in county jail. A moment of fear, a hard reset, a return to normal life. But Mike wasn't responding like most people would. Even inside jail, his mind didn't slow down. He kept thinking about his system, refining it mentally, adjusting diagrams in his head, planning improvements as if nothing had changed except his location. When he was released after those 60 days, instead, he came back more obsessed than before. And the first thing he did wasn't to walk away from the experiment. This time, he claimed he was doing everything legally. New parts, properly acquired equipment, a more controlled design, better stabilization methods, more precise configuration. But the obsession had already deepened beyond control. And when he restarted the experiments, something began to happen that made everything before it look small. Objects didn't just flicker anymore. They disappeared for seconds at a time. And when they returned, they weren't always the same. A wooden block came back ice cold, like it had been frozen somewhere far away. A flower returned wilted, as if days had passed instead of seconds. Small test objects behaved as if something had changed while they were gone. And that's when Mike stopped thinking he was dealing with an illusion. Because now the effects were too consistent, too repeatable, too real. But instead of fear slowing him down, it did the opposite. It pulled him deeper. Because if the system was becoming stronger, then he believed he was finally getting closer to something no one else had ever reached. And that's when the experiment stopped being just strange and started becoming dangerous. The warning signs. At this point, Mike had built a system that produced results, not just once, not just under rare conditions, but again and again, in ways he could measure, record, and repeat. That's what made it more dangerous, because now, every time he turned the system on, he expected something to happen, and something always did. He refined the setup further. Better control over the electrical field, more precise alignment of the rods, and stronger and more stable laser input. And the effects followed. Objects placed inside the field would disappear for longer durations, not fractions of a second anymore, 3 seconds, sometimes more. And when they came back, the changes were impossible to ignore. Even simple materials started behaving like they had been exposed to completely different environments. That alone should have been enough to stop, but Mike needed one more step. Because objects don't tell you everything. living things do. At first, he hesitated, but only for a moment. Then, he brought in a mouse. He placed it near the field, activated the system, and watched. The mouse disappeared. Not flickered, not blurred. Gone for 5 full seconds, and when it came back, it was alive. But something was wrong. It didn't move normally. Its behavior was erratic, confused, as if it couldn't understand where it was or what had just happened. It avoided food, stayed restless, disoriented in a way that didn't match anything Mike had seen before. He kept observing it for 2 days, and then it died. That moment should have ended everything, because now it wasn't about objects anymore. It was about life and what the system was doing to it. But instead of stepping back, Mike started thinking in a different direction. If a mouse could survive the transition, even briefly, then maybe the system wasn't destroying things. Maybe it was sending them somewhere. Somewhere where time didn't move the same way. Somewhere that wasn't meant to be reached. And that idea didn't scare him enough to stop. It pulled him further in. It turned his attention to the one variable he had been avoiding from the start. The final experiment. By early 1996, Mike had reached a point where nothing else felt enough. Small tests, controlled objects, even living subjects. None of it answered the question that had been building in his mind from the start. What actually happens inside the field? That question stayed with him until he finally spoke about it. In late February 1996, Mike made one last call to Coast AM. This time, his voice was different, less uncertain, more intense, almost like he had already made up his mind about something he hadn't done yet. He told Art Bell that the system had changed again. The field was no longer limited to small objects. It had expanded. And then he said something that shifted the entire tone of the call. He had already tested it on himself, not fully, but partially. Stepping into the edge of the field, just enough to feel it. And what he described didn't sound like electricity anymore. He said time felt wrong inside it, like everything around him slowed down, while he remained normal. And when he stepped back out, more time had passed outside than he had experienced inside. That detail stayed with everyone listening. Because if true, it meant the field wasn't just affecting objects. It was affecting perception, maybe even time itself. Art Bell tried to slow him down. He told him to stop working alone, to bring in scientists, to document everything properly, and not to take risks without oversight. But Mike wasn't in that place anymore. He spoke about needing more power, better stabilization, a final configuration that would hold the field long enough for a full test. And before the call ended, he made a promise. He would call back in March, with proof, video, measurements, everything. That call never came. March 1997, Mike was gone. His phone was disconnected. People who passed by the farmhouse said it looked abandoned, like no one had been there for days. And then, the fire. The garage burned down. What investigators found there was strange. Melted copper, destroyed transformers, and a perfect 6-foot circular burn pattern scorched into the concrete. But there was no sign of Mike anywhere. Not even a trace of his body, just that note left behind inside a metal toolbox. It's not about time, it's about how you see things. Officially, the case didn't go far. It was assumed he fled, maybe to avoid consequences, maybe to disappear on his own terms. But the people who had followed his story didn't accept that so easily, because the details didn't line up. And slowly, word started spreading, from local talk to radio discussions to early internet forums. Within months, Mike Markham wasn't just a missing person. He had become something else. A story people couldn't stop thinking about. A mystery with no clear ending. For years, people kept searching for answers, trying to piece together what really happened inside that garage. And then, among all the theories, one idea began to stand out. Not because it was proven, but because it felt too real to ignore. The 1930 body theory. In the summer of 1998, an online researcher found an old newspaper clipping from 1930. It described a body discovered on a California beach. A man estimated to be in his early 30s. Nothing unusual at first. But then came the details. The clothing he was wearing didn't match the time. It looked off. Not exactly modern in a clear way, but not something typical for 1930 either. Subtle differences, small inconsistencies that didn't sit right. And then there was the object found in his pocket, a small rectangular metal device, covered in buttons, strange markings, no clear purpose. At the time, it was photographed, catalogued, and then forgotten. But when that image resurfaced decades later, people started noticing something unsettling. The layout of the device, the arrangement of its components, even the rough design language. It looked similar to the kind of control units Mike had been sketching in his own diagrams. Not identical, but close enough to raise questions. Could it be a coincidence? Maybe. But once that connection was made, the theory started forming on its own. What if Mike didn't just disappear? What if the field didn't push him forward, but somewhere else entirely? What if he ended up in the past? And what if that body from 1930 was him? The timeline didn't make sense. The evidence wasn't solid, but the idea refused to go away. Because for the first time, there was something physical tied to the story. Not just a burned garage, not just a missing person, but a record from decades earlier that seemed to echo the same pattern. And for years, that's where the story stayed. An open question, a theory that couldn't be proven, but couldn't be fully dismissed either, until much later, when something surfaced that didn't just suggest where Mike might have gone, but hinted at something far more unsettling. Not that he had traveled through time, but that he had never really left at all. The unperceivable return, March 2022. That's when something appeared that didn't just reopen the case. It changed it completely. A couple in rural Ohio, Andrew and Melanie Carter, had just bought an old farmhouse, and while renovating the attic, they found something hidden behind insulation, a heavy wooden box, old, sealed, deliberately placed. On it, a label, M. Markham. Inside, there were journals, handwritten notes, detailed circuit diagrams, burned components, preserved carefully, and dates stretching far beyond 1997, all the way to 2021. That alone didn't make sense. But then came something even stranger, a Polaroid photograph showing a man standing next to a large ring-shaped machine. On the back, a date, June 21st, 2021, and a single line written underneath. It did work, but not the way I thought it would. The Carters posted about it online. The story spread fast. And then, just weeks later, a phone call came. No caller ID. A voice on the other end, tired, worn, but familiar to those who had heard the old recordings. "This is Mike Markham. I hear you found my box." He asked to visit. And when he arrived, everything seemed normal, and not normal at the same time. He looked older than he should have, not just by age, but by experience, like someone who had been through something long, heavy, and impossible to explain. And what he told them didn't match any of the theories. He said he never traveled through time. The machine didn't move him forward or backward. It did something else. It pushed him out of sync. He called it the unmemory effect. He was still in the same world, same places, same moments, but no longer fully connected to them, like being slightly off frequency, present, but not fully there. People could see him, talk to him, but they couldn't hold on to him. He said every time he exposed himself to the field, it got worse. He wasn't disappearing physically. He was becoming harder to remember, harder to recognize, harder to exist in the minds of others. He had spent years like that, moving through places where no one could keep track of him, working jobs where people forgot he worked there, living in spaces where his presence never fully registered, until he realized something, that one day the process would complete, and he would still be there, but no one would ever be able to remember that he was. When he left the Carter house that day, something strange happened. Within minutes, they struggled to recall his face. Within an hour, his voice started fading. Within days, they had to rely on written notes to remember the conversation at all. Not because they forgot naturally, but because something about him refused to stay in memory. And that's when the story changed. Because this was no longer about time travel. It was about something much deeper. What happens when the thing that makes you real to others starts breaking? Not your body, not your mind, but their ability to remember you at all. Maybe Mike Markham didn't disappear into time. Maybe he's still here, moving through the same world as everyone else, seen for a moment and then gone, in the only way that truly erases someone. Not death, but being forgotten. I hope you enjoyed this video. Make sure you give it a thumbs up. Also, consider subscribing to the channel if you haven't already, because we'll be uploading more crazy stories like this one in the coming weeks. Until then, see ya!